You know what the worst part is?
What?
I spent 40 years thinking silence meant peace.
Lower your voice.
No, not this time.
The neighbors will hear you.
Maybe someone should have heard us years ago.
Thomas.
Tell me the truth. When exactly did you stop loving me?
I don't remember.
Lauren, I can't find your father.
What do you mean you can't find him?
He's gone.
Did you two fight again?
At 5:12 in the morning, the kitchen light inside the Hale residence was already on. The rest of the neighborhood remained dark and silent, the kind of silence that only exists in wealthy suburban streets before sunrise, where every lawn is trimmed perfectly and every house seems to promise stability. Through the uncovered kitchen window, two figures sat motionless across from each other at the dining table. Neither touched the coffee in front of them. Neither spoke. After 43 years of marriage, Thomas and Evelyn Hale had become experts at silence. To anyone passing by, they might have looked peaceful, comfortable, familiar. But something inside that room had shifted long before the sun came up. Hours later, Thomas Hale would disappear without a trace. His car would still be parked in the driveway. His wallet would still sit beside the fruit bowl near the refrigerator. His phone charger would remain plugged into the wall upstairs. And the only thing investigators would later discover missing from the home was a framed photograph taken during the couple's honeymoon in Cape Cod in the summer of 1982. By the time Evelyn finally called their daughter shortly after 4 in the afternoon, nearly 11 hours had passed since she claimed she had last seen her husband. The first thing she said was not, "Thomas is missing." It was, "I think something terrible has happened." And for the next several weeks, nobody could decide whether Evelyn Hale sounded like a grieving wife, or a woman trying desperately to stay ahead of the truth. The disappearance stunned the town of Fairfield Glen because the Hales were the couple everybody thought they understood. Thomas had spent nearly 3 decades building a respected commercial real estate business across Connecticut. Evelyn volunteered at libraries, chaired charity dinners, and remembered every neighbor's birthday. They attended church regularly, hosted Christmas parties every December, vacationed in predictable places. Their lives looked carefully arranged, almost rehearsed. But investigators quickly discovered something unsettling beneath that polished image. The couple had retired less than 18 months earlier, and according to nearly everyone close to them, retirement had changed the atmosphere inside the house completely. Friends described tension that seemed impossible to explain. Their daughter Lauren admitted she had started limiting visits because being around them together felt exhausting. Their son Michael described dinners where his parents barely acknowledged each other's presence. Yet neither Thomas nor Evelyn had ever spoken openly about separation. No police reports existed. No history of violence. No obvious motive for disappearance or foul play. Still, detectives kept returning to one troubling detail. Evelyn waited almost an entire day before contacting anyone. She claimed she assumed Thomas had gone for a walk to clear his head after an argument. But Thomas suffered from severe arthritis in both knees and rarely walked farther than the end of the block without discomfort. Even stranger, he had left behind medication he depended on daily. Investigators began asking uncomfortable questions almost immediately. Had Thomas truly left on his own? Was Evelyn hiding what happened inside the house that morning? Or had decades of quiet resentment finally exploded into something irreversible? Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always love hearing from you. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you never miss stories like this. Because the deeper investigators looked into the Hale marriage, the more they realized this was not the story of a sudden disappearance. It was the story of two people who had spent decades learning how not to say what they truly felt, until silence itself became dangerous. Thomas Hale met Evelyn Mercer in the spring of 1979 during a fundraising banquet in Hartford. Thomas was ambitious, sharply dressed, and unusually confident for a 29-year-old man still trying to establish himself professionally. Evelyn had recently finished graduate school and briefly considered pursuing museum curation before stepping away from that path after their engagement. Friends described their early relationship as intensely practical rather than passionate. They were compatible in all the ways that looked impressive to other people. Thomas valued structure, routine, and discipline. Evelyn brought warmth, patience, and social grace into every room she entered. Together they built the kind of life many people spend years trying to achieve. 2 children. A large colonial home. Financial stability. Predictable holidays. But over time, the marriage developed an invisible imbalance that neither of them ever openly addressed. Thomas worked constantly during the peak years of his career. Sometimes 70 hours a week. Business dinners. Flights. Conferences. Weekend calls. Evelyn became the emotional center of the family while Thomas became more like a respected visitor passing through it. Their children later described him as dependable but distant, a man who provided everything except emotional closeness. For decades, the arrangement somehow worked because absence prevented conflict. Thomas rarely spent enough uninterrupted time at home for resentment to fully surface. But retirement changed the rhythm of their lives overnight. Suddenly, 2 people who had quietly evolved into strangers found themselves sharing every hour of every day. The first few months after retirement appeared normal from the outside. Thomas golfed occasionally. Evelyn joined gardening groups and book clubs. They renovated parts of the house together. Friends recalled seeing them laugh at dinners and community events. But inside the home, subtle tensions started becoming impossible to ignore. Thomas struggled deeply with the loss of structure and professional identity. For nearly 40 years, he had measured his worth through schedules, meetings, and negotiations. Without work, he became restless and irritable. Evelyn, meanwhile, had spent decades shaping her life around everyone else's needs. Retirement was supposed to feel liberating. Instead, she found herself constantly monitored inside her own home. Thomas commented on how she loaded the dishwasher. How much time she spent on the phone. How often she left the house. Tiny observations turned into daily criticism. Their daughter Lauren later remembered visiting during Thanksgiving and noticing that her parents communicated almost entirely through corrections. Pass the salt. You forgot to lock the side door. You already told that story. No screaming. No dramatic fights. Just exhaustion. The kind that settles slowly over people after years of pretending everything is fine. Then older wounds began resurfacing. About 20 years earlier, Thomas had developed a close emotional relationship with a coworker during an especially difficult period in the marriage. The affair had never become physical, at least according to Thomas, but Evelyn discovered letters and phone records that shattered her trust permanently. They stayed together largely because of their children and social expectations. The incident was buried publicly, but privately it never disappeared. Retirement removed distractions, and unresolved pain returned quietly into daily conversations. Small arguments suddenly carried decades of history behind them. One evening during dinner with friends, Thomas jokingly remarked that Evelyn had always been too sensitive. The room laughed politely. Evelyn smiled. But later that night, according to a neighbor who overheard raised voices through an open window, Evelyn repeated the phrase back to him again and again in tears. Too sensitive. Too sensitive for 40 years. By the winter before Thomas disappeared, their routines had become painfully separate. Evelyn began spending long afternoons away from the house without clearly explaining where she went. Sometimes she drove aimlessly for hours. Sometimes she sat alone in coffee shops reading. Once, according to credit card records later reviewed by investigators, she booked a hotel room 30 miles away and stayed overnight alone without informing Thomas beforehand. When questioned later, she simply said she needed quiet. Thomas responded by becoming increasingly controlling about finances and household schedules. He tracked grocery expenses obsessively. He criticized Evelyn's purchases. He complained to friends that retirement felt less like freedom and more like being trapped inside somebody else's habits. Yet despite all this tension, neither pursued divorce seriously. Their identities had become too entangled. Their social world depended on maintaining appearances. They had spent so many years presenting themselves as stable that admitting failure felt impossible. Then came the notebook. 3 months before his disappearance, Thomas started documenting daily events inside the home in a small leather journal investigators would later recover from his office drawer. The entries were not dramatic at first. Observations about arguments. Notes about Evelyn leaving without explanation. Frustrations over feeling ignored. But gradually the tone darkened. He described feeling unwanted inside his own house. Invisible. Humiliated. One entry simply read, we survived marriage by staying apart. Now there's nowhere left to go. Another entry mentioned fear that Evelyn resented him enough to wish he'd disappear. Investigators became deeply interested in these writings because they complicated everything. Was Thomas genuinely afraid? Or was he constructing a narrative intentionally? At the same time, Evelyn had quietly reconnected online with a man she briefly dated before meeting Thomas decades earlier. His name was Leonard Briggs, a retired history professor living in Vermont. Their messages were emotionally intimate but not explicitly romantic. They discussed aging, loneliness, regret, and the feeling of becoming strangers within long marriages. Investigators discovered the correspondence only after obtaining Evelyn's deleted emails. One message sent just 2 weeks before Thomas vanished read, "Sometimes I wonder who I might have become if I had left years ago." That sentence alone changed the direction of the investigation dramatically. Their son Michael added another layer of concern after revealing he noticed bruising on Evelyn's forearm during a family dinner roughly 1 month before the disappearance. When he asked about it, she laughed it off clumsily, claiming she had bumped into a cabinet. But Michael later admitted the explanation never felt convincing. Still, there was no evidence Thomas had ever physically abused her. Friends described him as rigid and emotionally cold at times, but never violent. The uncertainty created a disturbing tension around the entire case. Everyone close to the couple seemed to possess fragments of a truth nobody fully understood. Then, 5 days before Thomas disappeared, something happened that investigators initially overlooked. Thomas received a phone call shortly after midnight and immediately stepped outside to continue the conversation privately. Security footage from a neighboring property showed him pacing near the driveway for almost 20 minutes despite freezing temperatures. The next morning he appeared distracted and unusually quiet. Evelyn later claimed she asked who called, but Thomas refused to answer. Detectives eventually traced the number to Leonard Briggs, the same man Evelyn had been confiding in for months. Nobody knew exactly what was said during that conversation. But after the call, Thomas's journal entries became noticeably more emotional. "I wasted years competing with ghosts," he wrote 2 nights later. "Now I think she's already gone." The final 24 hours before the disappearance unfolded with painful slowness once investigators reconstructed them. On the evening before Thomas vanished, the couple attended a small dinner gathering at a neighbor's home. Witnesses later described them as unusually tense. Thomas barely participated in conversation. Evelyn drank more wine than usual. At one point, another guest jokingly asked how retirement life was treating them, and Thomas answered with a smile that seemed almost rehearsed. Turns out marriage works better when one person isn't home all day. Several people laughed awkwardly. Evelyn did not. She stared at her plate for several seconds before excusing herself to the bathroom. It was the kind of uncomfortable moment most people forget quickly. But after the disappearance, every detail suddenly felt important. According to Evelyn, the argument began shortly after midnight when they returned home. She claimed Thomas confronted her about Leonard Briggs after finding recent emails on her tablet. Their discussion escalated into accusations about the past, old betrayals, wasted years, and resentment neither had fully expressed before. Evelyn later described Thomas as emotionally devastated rather than angry. She insisted he accused her of emotionally abandoning the marriage long before retirement. At some point during the night, Evelyn moved into the guest bedroom upstairs. Thomas remained awake downstairs. Phone records confirmed he made 3 outgoing calls between 2:11 and 4:40 in the morning. None were answered. Then came the strangest part of the timeline. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes captured no footage of Thomas leaving the property. No vehicle movement. No pedestrians. No activity near the driveway. Yet sometime between dawn and mid-morning, Thomas vanished completely. Evelyn claimed she woke around 9, assumed he had gone out, and spent most of the day waiting for him to return. Investigators struggled to understand why she appeared so calm for so many hours. That confusion deepened when forensic teams discovered faint traces of blood near a basement storage area. The scene appeared partially cleaned. Not enough blood to confirm a homicide, but enough to suggest some kind of physical incident had occurred. Evelyn insisted she had no explanation for it. Detectives did not believe her. As media attention intensified, the Hale family began unraveling publicly. Lauren defended her mother fiercely during early interviews, insisting Thomas had become emotionally manipulative after retirement. Michael took the opposite position, privately telling detectives he believed both parents were hiding things from the family for years. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered more entries from Thomas's journal suggesting he feared Evelyn planned to leave him permanently. One passage described retirement as watching someone slowly erase you while sitting 3 feet away. Another mentioned considering disappearing voluntarily, just to see whether anyone would notice the difference. Evelyn's behavior continued raising suspicion. She deleted several voicemails from the week before Thomas vanished. She contacted Leonard Briggs repeatedly after the disappearance but initially denied doing so. Financial records also showed she had quietly consulted a divorce attorney 6 months earlier. Yet detectives remained uncertain because key evidence contradicted a deliberate murder theory. No body. No financial motive strong enough to explain violence. No history of criminal behavior. Instead, the case increasingly resembled a psychological collapse unfolding inside a marriage that had remained emotionally unfinished for decades. Then investigators discovered something unexpected hidden behind books in Thomas's office. A sealed envelope addressed simply, "If I disappear." Inside was a handwritten letter describing his belief that Evelyn no longer loved him and intended to leave once she felt financially secure enough to do so. But the tone of the letter was not fearful. It sounded theatrical. Almost performative. Thomas described fantasies about vanishing completely, so Evelyn would finally understand what life without him felt like. The discovery shifted investigative theory dramatically. Detectives started considering whether Thomas may have staged his own disappearance intentionally. The breakthrough came from overlooked security footage recorded by a delivery truck parked across the street during the early morning hours of Thomas's disappearance. The footage showed dim movement near the basement side entrance shortly before sunrise. After enhancing the recording, investigators identified both Thomas and Evelyn partially visible through the doorway. They appeared to be struggling physically over a cardboard storage box. Then suddenly Thomas lost balance and fell backward out of frame. Evelyn froze. Several seconds passed before she disappeared from view. The footage contained no audio, but investigators no longer believed this was premeditated murder. Under renewed questioning, Evelyn finally admitted what happened. Thomas had confronted her during the night about Leonard and accused her of planning to abandon him after decades of sacrifice. The argument continued for hours until Thomas revealed something shocking. He intended to stage his disappearance temporarily to punish her emotionally and expose her publicly as an unfaithful wife. He had packed personal items secretly and removed the honeymoon photograph intentionally. According to Evelyn, the confrontation resumed near the basement because Thomas was gathering supplies he planned to take. During the struggle over the box, she grabbed his arm to stop him from leaving. Thomas lost footing near the basement stairs and fell backward onto the concrete floor below. The injury was catastrophic. Evelyn insisted she panicked immediately. Thomas was unconscious, bleeding heavily, and within minutes she realized he was dead. But instead of calling emergency services, fear consumed her judgment. She believed nobody would accept the fall as accidental after years of marital tension and the evidence of her emotional involvement with Leonard Briggs. So she cleaned part of the scene, delayed contacting family, and allowed investigators to believe Thomas had disappeared voluntarily. The lie grew larger every day until she no longer knew how to reverse it. When authorities eventually recovered Thomas's body from a wooded property roughly 20 miles away, public sympathy fractured sharply. Some viewed Evelyn as a calculating woman who concealed a death for self-preservation. Others saw 2 aging people crushed slowly under the weight of decades spent avoiding honest conversations. During sentencing, the judge described the case not as one driven by hatred but by emotional exhaustion. Evelyn received a reduced sentence after evidence supported the accidental nature of the fall and lack of premeditation. Still, the damage to the family was permanent. In the years that followed, neighbors continued describing the Hales as the perfect couple, though now the phrase carried a different meaning. Perfect from a distance. Perfect in photographs. Perfect in carefully managed public moments. But perfection had required silence. Silence about loneliness. Silence about resentment. Silence about the possibility that 2 people could spend 40 years together without truly knowing how to live beside one another honestly. Retirement did not destroy Thomas and Evelyn's marriage. It simply removed the distractions that had hidden its fractures for decades. Their story unsettled people because it felt uncomfortably ordinary beneath the tragedy. No dramatic affair. No criminal conspiracy. No monstrous villain hiding in plain sight. Just two aging people confronting the terrifying realization that time had quietly transformed them into strangers sharing the same house. And perhaps that is what makes the case linger long after the investigation ended. Not the disappearance. Not the cover-up. But the question underneath it all. How many relationships survive only because life keeps people too busy to notice what they've become? And when the noise finally fades, what happens if the person sitting across the table is no longer someone you recognize at all? After everything you've heard, do you believe Evelyn meant to hurt Thomas, or was this the tragic ending of a marriage that had been falling apart for years? Could years of silence destroy even the strongest relationship? And if you were in Evelyn's position that night, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below because this story raises questions that don't have easy answers. And if stories like this keep you thinking long after they end, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next emotional mystery.